Hello, class. The topic of our lecture today is South Carolina blacks in the American Revolution. When you hear the name South Carolina, more than likely you think about its connections with the Civil War. After all, it was the first state to secede from the Union, and the war officially began here when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. Strictly speaking, however, this was not the first Civil War in South Carolina, since the definition of a Civil War is one fought between citizens of the same country. The first Civil War in the state was fought during the American Revolution between the Patriots and the Loyalists. A good example of this is the Battle of Kings Mountain fought in 1780, where there was only one non resident participating, the British commander of the Loyalist troops, Patrick Ferguson. Although South Carolina at that time was divided into two sections, the Low Country, which extended from the coast 50 miles into the interior, and the Back Country, the rest of the state, there were patriots and loyalists in both areas. Most of the state's wealth was concentrated in the Low Country, home to large rice plantations and the majority of the slave population. The Back Country was sparsely settled, and there were very few slaves living there. The back country was also a lawless place subject to outrages by Indians and roving bands of outlaws. Courts were non existent. All were located in Charleston. Charleston, then known as Charlestown, was the wealthiest city in the 13 colonies and the largest city, the busiest port, and the economic and political capital of the southern colonies. Although slavery was not an issue in this war, it did have an impact. In order to explain its significance, we need to go back to the early history of South Carolina. Only then will we be able to more fully understand the role that South Carolina blacks played in the American Revolution. We will look at pertinent population statistics, laws, and other events relative to blacks, both African slaves and free blacks, before we move on to a general discussion of black participation. We will end with two examples of extraordinary black men who served and gave aid to the Patriot cause. Let's begin now with population figures. Slaves were present in the state from its earliest days as a royal province. In 1670, the first African slaves were brought to English Carolina. At that time, the estimated total population of the settlement was 155. Of these, 15 were slaves. In 1679, the settlement was moved to the present day site of Charleston. In 1680, the estimated population was 1,200, which included 200 African slaves. By 1700, the estimated population of the province was 5,500, and there were probably 2,400 African slaves. In 1708, the governor reported population figures for the state. African slaves, 4,100, and whites, 4,080. This was the first time that there was a black majority in South Carolina. Peter H. Wood's book, Black Majority, Negroes in Colonial South Carolina from 1670 through the Stono Rebellion, published in 1996, remains the definitive work on this subject. Now, just before the Revolution in 1770, estimated population of the province was 130,000, and of these, approximately 80,000 were slaves. In 1780, estimated population figures 180,000 total, and about 97,000 of these were African slaves. So you can see in a 10-year period, population of the state grew by 50,000 people. Now, the first official U.S. Census was taken in 1790. It recorded a white population of 140,178. African slaves, there were 107,094, and free blacks, 1,801, for a total of almost 250,000 people. To put these figures into perspective, the number of African slaves in the state grew from just 15 in 1670 to 107,094 in 1790. The white population grew from 140 to 140,178 during the same period. Blacks made up a majority of the population beginning in 1708, and this trend continued until 1780. From 1730 to 1750, African slaves made up approximately two-thirds of South Carolina's population. Now, moving on to laws and other situations, rice was first introduced into the colony in 1672, and by the mid 1680s, it was being grown commercially. African slaves were knowledgeable about its cultivation and were resistant to malaria, which made them excellent laborers at this uh, terrible occupation. In 1690, South Carolina enacted its first law relating to slavery, and in 1696, it enacted its first comprehensive slave law. In 1698, the Commons House of Assembly, the local ruling body in the colony, passed a law granting 13 pounds sterling to anyone who would bring a white male servant into the province. They were already fearful of the growing number of slaves at that time. In 1721, a new act merged the militia and slave patrols. Policing slaves was now the militia's number one priority. Slaves could be stopped on sight for any reason. In August 1730, the first slave conspiracy in British South Carolina was detected. It may have included as many as 200 participants, and its ringleaders were executed. In April 1739, the Commons House of Assembly placed a tax on the sale of recently imported slaves. It ran as high as 100 pounds sterling, and this greatly reduced the African slave trade. In May, the Commons House of Assembly passed the Negro Act, laws that regulated the life and activities of slaves. It lasted until the Civil War, largely unchanged. In September 1739, the first slave insurrection, the infamous Stono River Rebellion, resulted in the deaths of 20 whites and 40 slaves. There were no successful insurrections from this time through the American Revolutionary era, but there were attempts and rumors. In 1742, the Reverend Alexander Garden opened a school for slaves in Charlestown. On January 1st of 1766, an act passed earlier in August 1764 went into effect, and it cut off the African slave trade for 3 years. There was a tax of 100 pounds sterling for each slave imported. In August of 1775, patriots hanged and burned the free black pilot Thomas Jeremiah in Charlestown. He had been accused of plotting to aid the Royal Navy and of instigating an insurrection. In May 1775, Henry Lawrence, a wealthy Charleston politician, businessman, planter, and slave owner, received a letter from London which contained a rumor that the British aimed to incite the Indians and slaves against the patriots, and it had the effect of increasing opposition to the royal government. At that time, Henry Lawrence and his son John Lawrence, also wealthy and a politician, were unorthodox in their belief that slaves should be granted their freedom. Both worked towards that goal. John convinced Congress to approve blacks for military service, but his home state did not agree, and his plan never got off the ground. The elder Lawrence was president of the Provincial Congress and of the Council of Safety, elected in June 1775 to both positions. In March 1776, he was elected the first vice president of South Carolina, and he was elected and served as president of the Continental Congress from November 1777 to December 1778. Now, in November of 1778, the Southern campaign began when Cornwallis focused his attention on the Southern colonies. He thought there were way too many loyalists in the colonies, and he didn't think he was going to have much of a problem. Now, this lasted until 1781. Major British victories in South Carolina included the siege and fall of Charleston in May 1780 and the Battle of Camden in August of that same year. Important patriot victories in the state that marked the turning point of the Revolution were won at Kings Mountain in October and at Cowpens in January 1781. And of course, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, which, for all intents and purposes, ended the war. Even so, it was over a year later in December 1782 when British forces evacuated Charlestown, taking some 4,200 loyalists and 5,000 African slaves. Now, turning now to the important role that South Carolina blacks played in the American Revolution, M. Foster Farley's work on the subject resulted in a paper, The South Carolina Negro in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, published in the South Carolina Historical Magazine in April 1978. At that time, Professor Farley was an associate professor of history at Newberry College in Newberry, South Carolina. According to Farley, South Carolina blacks were impressed into service by the Americans and by the British. In South Carolina, they provided labor on forts and bridges and roads. Although their use as soldiers in the Army was debated by both state and continental authorities, they served in the Navy as crewmen, workmen, and pilots and had done so since the beginning of the colony. They were also employed in the shipyards and on the docks. Thousands of blacks were used in construction projects and in support of the Army. The Council of Safety passed a resolution that all able bodied Negro men would be taken into public service and employed without arms in defense of the batteries in Charlestown. This included slaves and free blacks. In June 1776, their contributions really came into play at the Battle of Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. Patriots were able to keep the British fleet from sailing into Charleston Harbor, and although it was unfinished, Fort Moultrie survived the attack. It was made of palmetto logs and had been constructed with slave labor. Blacks were also used as spies, messengers, and guides. In March 1783, the General Assembly cited the slave Antigua for his services behind enemy lines, where he discovered and relayed information on the enemy's movements and plans. Antigua, his wife Hagar, and their child were granted their freedom. Another example of extraordinary service came in the person of a free black man, Jim Capers. Capers had been born in slavery in 1742 on an island plantation north of Charlestown. Capers may or may not have been free when he enlisted in 1775, but pension papers suggest that he was. 33-year-old Capers enlisted in the 4th South Carolina Regiment as a drum major in June 1775. In the 18th century military structure, a drum major's signals conveyed orders on the battlefield, and in camp it marked daily duties, wake up, meals, drills, etc. Such a position placed him in the center of Army life and in harm's way. Capers was present at the Battle of Savannah in 1778, the 1779 siege of Savannah, and the fall of Charleston in 1780. He served with General Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, at the Battle of Camden. He was severely wounded at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in 1781, where he received two saber cuts to the chest, one to the face, and was shot through the left side by a musket ball. He survived and returned to service 3 weeks later, and according to his pension papers, was present at the surrender of Yorktown. He was honorably discharged in 1782. Following the war, Capers returned to Sumter County, South Carolina, and married a slave woman, Millie, in 1826. He was 84 years old at that time. They moved to Alabama and had 6 children. In 1849, Capers applied for a Revolutionary War pension. He was over 100 years old. He had just found out that he was eligible and had been since 1832. At that time, he was living on a plantation with Millie, who was still a slave. Although he did not have his discharge papers, the plantation owner, fellow veterans, and others attested to his service and good character, and he was granted a pension of $8 per month. He died in 1853 at age 111 before he had received his first payment. His wife, however, was freed and was allowed to collect his pension. And today there are plans to dedicate a 7-acre park in his name and a monument in his honor on the battlefield at Eutaw Springs. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture on the importance of blacks in the American Revolution in South Carolina. Thank you.